All right, I want to get going because we only have the next 2 weeks to tie this stuff together. The first 3 chapters of Genesis are not only a unit, well, 2 and 3 are a single, complete unit. 1 through 2:4 is the first story of creation. But one is dependent on the other and the way they're set down in the text. So that the first story of creation is God calling order out of chaos and setting the universe into motion. And it's basically, in the words of the text, good, very good, even the creation of humankind. But since that is not people's experience of the world, the second story of creation and what we commonly call the fall is really for the Jews a story about why things aren't as God ordered them to be. It's about moral responsibility. It's about the fact that God is absolutely righteous and therefore demands a certain holiness of those who bear his image. Remember, I told you when we talked about the first story of creation that when it says God created man in his image, there is that sense of that being vocational. It's not simply ontological. It's been read, and particularly in the West. By that I mean the Western Christianity. It has been read as ontological, so that when in the second story of creation it says God breathed into Adam, he became, and the old translation is living soul. It's a whole different meaning than the word in Hebrew, which is a complete or total human being. Humanity for the Jews is understood as a Trinity, just the same as we understand God as a Trinity. I want to look just for a moment at how the temptation story affects the New Testament. In the first instance, I would suggest you read Romans 5 and 6. This is the new Adam part of Paul's letter to the church in Rome. It, along with the 8th chapter of Romans and a couple other places I could point to as well, shows that Paul was as much into new creation or recreation as St. John was. In fact, it is, I'm convinced, a central theme. It is about the restoration of the world. It is not just about the salvation of mankind. It is a reversal of the curse. Now, as I told you when we talked about this, was a large, still is, it's a very open argument in Judaism as to whether man was mortal before the sin in the garden, or whether that was a result of what we commonly call the fall. It's fairly apparent to me that St. Paul fell into that school of rabbinic thought that said Adam was responsible for human mortality. And I point you again back to Romans 5 and 6. If by one man came death, he has this sense. I'm pretty certain, in fact, I'm almost positive, that the original author, which is virtually credited as J by everybody I know anyhow, really thought that man was mortal before as well as afterwards. I'm convinced Dr. Spacer is correct that in the original story, we have a story of the kind of coming of age of humankind. It's mankind in their adolescence. Think about it. It isn't until after Eve eats the fruit and Adam eats the fruit that they become aware of their own sexuality and all those sorts of things. It is also, if you read the text carefully, and I have found over the years that, forget the Hebrew, people don't even read the English text for what it says. And that goes for literalists as well. I am probably, by my very nature, a literalist. It's the first question that always needs to be asked. What does the text say? But if you look at the text as God's handing out the kind of harems, the kind of condemnations and banishments, you realize that what God says to Adam is simply a restatement of a truth. When we say every Ash Wednesday, from dust thou art, to dust thou shalt return. So that I think it's really more the knowledge of death, the reality of death, which, you know, when you're 18 is not nearly as real as it is when you get into later years. And by the time you get to a certain point, you've buried, you know, your parents and grandparents and all those sorts of things. So you begin to know. I used to tell people I always realized every time I read the burial office, and I've read it more times than I care to remember, that someday some bishop with a smile on his face would read it over me. I know 6. Well, actually, that's not true. I used to say I knew 6 that were waiting, but 3 of them are dead, so shows you how that goes. Anyhow, think for a moment about something that often gets glossed over. It's also part of the Lenten liturgy. It comes up like the first Sunday of Lent or something like that. And that's the temptations of our Lord. Now remember, there are only 2 complete temptation stories in the synoptics. One in Matthew, one in Luke. Mark says, you know, after Christ's baptism, the Spirit drives him out into the wilderness to be tempted. One short sentence. In John's Gospel, there is no temptation story of the same, you know, Christ in the wilderness with the devil. But there is something almost more important, and we'll talk about it in a minute. In the temptation stories in Matthew and Luke, they are almost identical. If you're at all familiar with them, you know simply that Luke or Matthew, it depends on who stole whose, reverses the order of the last 2 temptations. They're the same temptations. They just come sequentially different. The first is about reversing the natural order. Turn this stone into bread. Really upend the curse. Show everybody how powerful you are. The other two are about being God in the way in which most of us conceive of being godlike. If you read them carefully, you'll understand what I mean. They're both about accepting the order of things as they are, the world as it is, and using it to advantage, or doing the spectacular so that people will flock to you. Now, I said John doesn't have the temptation story in that way. He doesn't. However, he has a very real story of temptation, and that's in Gethsemane. Part of the passion narrative in John is Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane praying that this can pass from him. That's probably the most effective temptation there is. We have a tendency, and I've talked about this before, but it's vitally important as we very fast now approach Easter, to have an understanding about the incarnation, which is simply wrong and does injustice to that idea. I'm not sure at the end of the day anybody really understands it, but by the middle of the 20th century, in both Roman Catholic and Protestant theology, and I would say almost across the board in Protestant theology, and Rome is Rome, so they're pretty monolithic about certain things. Certain communities found that out this week with Francis. They thought he was so liberal. And he said, no, I'm sorry, we just can't bless sin. Ah, good for him. Anyway, the position was this, that the human Jesus died upon the cross, and the divine Christ rose on Easter morning. I was starkly reminded of that, by the way, this week. TV now is 90% ads. And there's one of these would-be preachers. He's probably a fine fellow. I don't know him at all. But that's basically what he said. As a kind of push to, do you know where you're going for eternity, sort of thing. And when I say to him, no, and neither do you. That's all right. It's not that I don't believe I'll be in the hands of God. I just think you should never say you know more than you know. That's a misunderstanding of this whole thing. In the Orthodox Church, and a little behind us, because they're normally behind us, in the celebration of Easter. But when they say, Alleluia, Christos anastasis, for millennium it's meant Christ is risen, and that's what it actually means, but it also means the grave is empty. The physical Jesus is resurrected. Some of you may know that Mark's gospel, as we have it, the last 8 verses are appended. That's because the edge of the scroll fell off. It's not because there wasn't another ending. Somebody had to make it up somewhere. Because it ends with the phrase, they were terrified for. They've just walked into the tomb, it's empty, and Mark says they were terrified. Gar. This is how we know there was more, because nobody would end a sentence that way. They were terrified for. Before the present insanity about the primacy of Mark's gospel, it was a Reader's Digest version of Matthew and Luke. But there was also more emphasis on the fact that Mark has the remembrances of St. Peter. That's true whether it's first or, whether the outline came before or after is another argument. It does have the remembrances of Peter. And I think there is clearly one. If you walked into an empty tomb when you were expecting somebody you knew was dead as a doornail to be there, and they weren't, it would be a terrifying experience. In fact, it is my contention that the very early church had the very real experience of the resurrection. It wasn't something they felt. Jesus' spirit wasn't just around them, that kind of stuff which began mid-20th century and maybe a little before, actually. No, they had met, just as Paul claims, they had met the risen Lord. They had come face to face with a Jesus who on Good Friday was dead as a doornail and who had reversed all that was true about humankind. It and it alone is why the church grew. 3 centuries later, because they were still trying to preserve that understanding, we got something called the Trinity. It's at best a feeble explanation of something that's unexplainable. But underneath it is the absolute oneness of God. The doctrine of the Trinity would be unnecessary if it weren't upon the insistence of Scripture that God is one, and not just one in number, but one in design and plan. The fulfillment of that takes place in the incarnation. And the early church, it's pretty clear from St. Paul, that the early church understood it in the terms of Good Friday and Easter morning. There are absolutely no references to Christmas in any of Paul's writings, other than Romans, where he talks about Christ's lineage, Jesus' lineage, from David. Other than that, there aren't any. The birth narratives themselves were appended to the two Gospels that have them. And as you know, because we just did it, the Johannine Gospel has the idea of God's pre-existent plan to save humankind. It's why the garden scene, and it's set in a garden, note that, as, by the way, is the resurrection, the first resurrection appearance in John, is set in a garden. The Johannine writer knew exactly what he was doing. It was planned that way. That's not to say that those didn't happen. It's just to say that good writers know good scripts when they see them. The whole idea that death and sin are tied together is because death negates life. We used to have, it's still a family story. Mary and my wife had an Aunt Edna. In fact, we both had Aunt Ednas who weren't really our aunts. It was not unusual in our day and age. And Aunt Edna Peterson's father was something of a rounder, if you know what I mean. Delightful old man, but... And at the end, Edna was nursing him. He was fast passing this life. And she kept saying, Pops, Pops, come on, take another spoon of soup. And old Pop Peterson said, Edna, in all of eternity, do you think another spoon of soup will make a difference? What makes a difference for us is what Christ did, both on Calvary and on Easter morning. They are two sides of the same coin. They are not just a proof, Easter morning, that Jesus somehow was divine. There is a sense by which we realize very quickly that what Paul says in Romans 5 and 6 becomes true even in the beginnings of the Genesis story, because we go right from the fall to the conception of Cain and Abel, which you all know uses the Hebrew word new. Adam knew Eve, and Ephraim Spacer fiddles around to find a word that's adequate. Ephraim Spacer was probably one of the finest linguists of the Mideast that I know. That guy was brilliant. And he realizes that the consonantal root for to know is a very expansive term in Hebrew. So he translated it, Adam experienced Eve, which is closer to what the Hebrew means. It can have and does have sometimes a sexual connotation. The Jews didn't have a word for that per se, partly because they weren't prudes, but they were surrounded by so much fertility religion. All the Canaanite religions are fertility religions. Ashtaroth, Baal, they're sacred prostitutes. So they were they were always a little reticent about that. But anyhow, and immediately, we get the whole story of Cain and Abel. And fratricide is the next great sin. Might as well start big and work up. And then we get into all the begots. Now, teladot, which is the Hebrew word for it, is a signature word for what we call the P source. And almost all the begots belong to the priestly code. They are an attempt, and a lot of people played around with all the various things, not to speak of which rabbis who did. But they're really an attempt to tie the beginnings of Judaism to God's initial purpose in creation. They are almost unique in that. It isn't that there aren't other cultures or other faiths with kind of how the world began stories. But, you get the history of Romulus and Remus. I'll take something I'm reasonably comfortable with. You don't really have to get how the world started. You just have to get how Rome started. So, but for the Jews, because God is the king of the world, it's important to tie these beginnings of Judaism with the beginnings of the world itself. We move right through the begots. There's a little piece in there I'm going to avoid about the daughters of men and the giants and all that sort of thing. Nobody's ever quite figured out how that got in, and it just shows you sometimes the editors miss things. He was laying around on the cutting room floor, and that's what Ephraim says, and if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. But immediately, the next story is a story of the flood. Now, the flood story, I might add, is almost universal. It certainly is in that part of the world. But it is also in most other cultures. I mean, it's interesting. They're Chinese, the kind of Greco-Roman, all have stories of the flood. I'm not sure what that means, but I think there's some significance there that is lost on most of us, anyhow. It is important to note, from a Christian perspective, Noah, and you can, if you want to take the time, check this out, or you can take my word for it. Noah is the first man born after the death of Adam. I think that's not important, because what happens, of course, is that God decides this isn't working. I mean, if ever there was a story that it clearly opens the mind to the understanding of how Jews think about God, it's probably this story. Because God's saying, yeah, this was not a good idea. And again, Ephraim Spacer is very clear about this. A lot of translations say the sinfulness. The Hebrew really says the lawlessness, the disorder. Remember, in the first story of creation, God calls order out of chaos. When I used to do retreats and that sort of thing, I used to tell people, if your life is a soap opera, you might want to check in and see if you're living in touch with the will of God. Because I'm pretty certain, I'm not talking about people having troubles, don't misunderstand me. But all of you have to realize we live in a world that is chaotic. And it was not God's intention, originally or now. So, and that's the sense you get. The whole thing is out of control. And God says, but here's Noah. And Noah walks with God. He's had a forerunner in Enoch. We got a lot of time. We talk about how Enoch, the script is really open about what happens to Enoch. And when you get into the Intertestament period, you get a lot of fantastic literature. I mean, I grew up believing that Enoch was taken up into heaven. Kind of the assumption of the blessed Enoch. Since I don't believe in the assumption of the Blessed Virgin, it's a little hard to believe in that. But anyway, there's this sense by which, even though God has had second thoughts, the divine purpose is so purposeful, the divine intention, that even God, the oneness of God is so much a characteristic of God that even God can't completely. And so he finds Noah and his sons, and then, they take in the creatures and all that sort of thing. And God says, build a box. I know. Everybody's text says ark, but the Hebrew says box, because that's what an ark is. Now, it was a big box. It was 450 feet long, it was 75 feet wide, and 50 feet high. That's in feet instead of cubits. A cubit, by the way, is a length between here and here, so that my grandson has about a 2-inch longer cubit than I do. But cubits are taken, for the sake of conversion, at about 17.5 inches. I do 18 because it's just simpler math. So, and that's what the box comes out to. Now, you got to admit, 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 50 feet high, is a hunk. Not sure it's quite enough for, 8 families, and because we have Noah and his wife and 3 sons and their wives and all the animals. I mean, it's a little much, but it's not the point of the story anyhow. I mean, I always like to do Noah and the Ark because they have a silly ad on TV with a couple of giraffes, and they're making a boodle. It's a just so story with a point. And the point is that God, mad as he is, angry as he is, will save his creation. And so he piles them into the ark. The rains come. Remember the old Bob Newhart, Noah and God routine? Maybe you don't. It ends with Noah, who's Bob Newhart, or Bob Newhart, who's playing Noah, saying, "Rain, rain. It's always just been you and me, God, you and me." Because, of course, it hasn't rained up until this time. And so the ark lands. Everybody gets off. Noah, it turns out, is a grape grower. So he puts in a fresh crop, makes a great wine, has a little too much Mogan David, gets drunk, ends up naked, and the whole cycle starts again. But before, as the boat is landing on Arafat, God says, "Noah, I make you a promise, a covenant." Part of the theme, certainly through Genesis, is the covenantal nature of God. Covenants are always from the lesser, or from the greater to the lesser. So God says, "Noah, I make you a deal. Never again will I do this." Now, my fundamentalist forebears were always careful to note that God said he'd never send another deluge, and that's certainly true. They said that, or emphasized that, I should say, because they, like Father Chris's youth minister, thought the world was going to end by fire. I'm pretty sure that's... I mean, I've read most of the apocalyptic literature, not just Revelation, but the whole intra-testament. And it really doesn't ring true. But there will be calamities, catastrophes. But kind of end of the space-time continuum is, I think, not part of what's promised. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. It won't make any difference. Somebody suckered me into taking astronomy in my undergraduate years because we had to have 5 hours of non-lab science, and it was a cake course, except I got some guy who just took a doctorate at Yale in astrophysics. It wasn't a cake course. But I remember there was a big argument at the time whether the sun would burn out in 5 billion years or 50 billion years. I said, mate, I go for 50 billion, but I don't think it makes a difference. I'm not going to be around. I mean, it's not a relevant argument. So, whatever happens, Christians had the kind of understanding, or ought to have the understanding, that we're in the hands of God. But here again, you see, humankind has a defect. You want to call it as Calvin did, total depravity? Sorry, with me, I always say there's two things I got from the Calvinists: the sovereignty of God and total depravity, except that I understand total depravity a little bit different. And that's not that man is so evil, although God knows he can be, but he can never be good enough. In the end of the day, our own efforts are not sufficient. And if God's sovereign, they don't have to be. So there's this sense that for the Jews, God has a plan for creation, and that it's the vocation of the Jews to help God work this out. We're going to come very quickly next week to the final story in the first part of Genesis, the Tower of Babel. It's fascinating in its origins. It also plays out in the New Testament. The kind of separation of humankind is something that God does to keep people from getting ahead of themselves. And also to give the Democrats something to run. Oh, no, I'm not supposed to say that. There's no sense. You can't pass up some lines. Anyhow, this kind of understanding that in Jesus, God did more than just make sure everybody's soul gets into heaven, is critical to understanding not only the New Testament, but to answering the question why the church grew. Here's the thing. Not only wasn't the soul a major issue in Judaism, it wasn't a major issue in the surrounding world in the sense that we use it. Most good Platonists believed, irrespective of whether you were good or bad, when you died, the divine spark went back to the divine. Judaism has the unique position in the ancient world of believing that moral choice makes a difference. Nobody believes in free will the way we do. In fact, the whole scene in Gethsemane is Jesus choosing to die. And Baer brought out a very interesting, and I just throw this out because I haven't thought it through myself, says that may be one of the points of the virgin birth. Something to think about. Jesus isn't conceived the way you and I were. That's the whole point of the virgin birth. So it's a willing birth. I mean, most of us aren't born willingly. fact, why would we be? Who wants to give up a cush home? It's nice, it's warm, you're fed, you've got nothing to do. You can read all day long. I mean, children don't easily come into the world. So, and we talk, but we do have moral choice. This is the scripture, the understanding of moral choice. And this whole business that God expects us to choose to bear his image. And Christ, among other things, dies, at least if you read Paul properly, to grant us the grace to do that. And there's an old prayer, because I grew up with old prayers, called General Thanksgiving, which was part of the old morning prayer office. We, thy unworthy servants, do give thee most humble and hearty thanks for all thy goodness and loving kindness unto all men. We bless thee for our creation, preservation, and all the blessings of this life, but above all, for thine inestimable love in the redemption of the whole world, for the means of grace and the hope of glory. It is the whole point of the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega. We're running into Chris's time. So we're going to come back. We'll look at Babel and the call of Avram, and then I'll try to tie it all together for you. I'm reminded that going back and doing some of this, of the great stories in Genesis, Peniel and the sacrifice of Isaac and Joseph and his brothers. Joseph and his coat of long sleeves. I hate to tell you, it wasn't many colors. So, okay. Peace. Thanks.
Thank you.